Just a minute.
So some of the pictures I wanted to have we haven't got, but it doesn't matter.
Okay. Welcome again, everyone, including those people who joined us online. My name is Denis Maksimov. I'm a curator of art and programs here in Pushkin House. And today we're excited to welcome Lucy Ash, the author of The Baton and the Cross, the book that covers the intricate and interesting relationships between Russian state and the church, starting from the foundation of the both, basically up to until the moments of now and the recent sad political history of this engagement. Lucy herself is a journalist. I would not list all your accolades and all your awards for all your radio work, but you lived in Moscow. Lucy lived in Moscow for several years in beginning of 90s. And from that time, her fascination with the entanglement of Russian past and present and its definition of the future actually grew into the question precisely covering the subject of the formulation of those values that are so much mentioned in the context of the recent changes, political changes in the Russian state. Values of the ethical and moral codes and intertwined with religion as well, and coming through a lot of different rocky stages from the point of the imperial history, Tsarist history, then imperial history, then going into the Soviet period and to the contemporary time. And the format of today's event is a conversation. Lucy will present the book mostly, and we will, together with you, pose her questions. We also invite the questions from the audience online. We have a full house today, so we expect and excited to hear a lot of interesting points and takes on that interesting question of the relations between the church and state in Russia. And first, Lucy, I wanted to ask you just to summarize maybe the book and the main key points that you make in there, and maybe you could tell also how exactly you arrived to that question and what was the core of it for you that made this subject so exciting.
Why I decided to write a book about the Russian Orthodox Church in the first place. The book is like in basically three parts. The first third is history up to the Russian Revolution. The second third is the Soviet era, perestroika, the 1990s, and then the third part is Putin, culminating in the Ukraine war, about which the news today is pretty bleak, as I'm sure you have gathered. Why I decided to write the book? Well, I've been fascinated by the Russian Orthodox Church ever since my first trips to Moscow, which was in the Brezhnev era. And everything on the outside in Moscow looked very grey, very uniform, monochrome. And when I walked into a church and I saw all these candles and the golden iconostasis and the brightly coloured shawls of the old ladies, I was really entranced, like a lot of people, and the singing as well, the liturgy, the choir. It seemed like a very intoxicating atmosphere. And I felt like I'd stumbled into some kind of secret world where on the surface there was all this kind of Soviet propaganda, you know, all the blocks of flats had big slogans on it about how communism was going to conquer the earth. And then there were these sort of felt like a place that people could retreat to and live their own inner life, fed by Russia's very rich spiritual traditions and culture. So I was interested in it, and then I also have met some quite interesting priests when I went back there in 1990 for the BBC, and I felt that the church could be an agent for good, an agent for change, that it could deal with a lot of Russia's social problems, alcoholism, homelessness, the terrible treatment of orphans in orphanages, HIV, drug addiction. There were lots of people in the church then that had all kinds of ideas about what they wanted to do. In retrospect, this was probably quite naive, but I was interested in it. And then why I decided to write about the church was partly against the backdrop of the first beginnings of the incursion into Donbass and the annexation of Crimea and the role of the church in that. But it was also because I made a film in 2019 about domestic violence, and I was very surprised, sort of shocked, that the church was so dead set against helping the most vulnerable people in society. It did everything it could to block an MP's attempt to bring in restraining orders, Oksana Pushkina, who wasn't really a very rebellious character. She was part of Putin's United Russia Party. But she did feel that the murder rate of women was kind of absolute, like, national shame, and she wanted to do something about it. And some of the fiercest opposition came from the church. You know, it was blocked at the highest level by Patriarch Kirill. But also there were Orthodox activists who were saying that stopping men from coming into their homes was going to be the genocide of the Russian family. This character, Andrei Kormukhin, who's also very active in getting bunches of his supporters around new churches. When local people say they'd rather have a park than a church, he sort of brings in his heavies to make sure that in the name of orthodoxy, the building project goes ahead. So I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the church's acting more and more like an arm of Kremlin policy abroad, talking about the war in Syria and how it was only Russia that really cared about the Christians of the Middle East, and the West, Europe, had abandoned them. And I thought that it was also the way to have a different insight into what was happening in Russian society. I first made a radio program about it after the Pussy Riot incident in 2012, when, you know, there was this very strong condemnation of the close relationship between the church and the state. And I thought with all these things, it would make sense to try and understand as an outsider, because I'm not brought up Orthodox. I don't really subscribe to any religion, although I'm very interested in religion. I have a lot of respect for orthodoxy, but I'm not an Orthodox believer myself. So some people were a bit sort of like, how can you write a book about this? But I felt that in a way, being outside it was useful.
Can you maybe walk just us through your interpretation of the development of that relationship between the church and the state? Where do you start in your book, and just through the whole maybe narrative?
The whole of the 1,000 years history.
Yeah, it's a task, but you take up on it in the book, but maybe a short version of it.
Well, very short version. 988 is when the Eastern Slavs adopt Christianity. And Grand Prince Vladimir, or Volodymyr as he's known in Ukraine, did this partly because he wasn't sort of that mystical as a character, and he had a whole bevy of concubines, and he was a sort of warrior. But he wanted to have one religion to unify the subjects in the lands that he and his brothers had conquered. And being pragmatic, he looked to Byzantium, to Constantinople, which was the great seat of orthodoxy. And he wanted to have good trading relationships with that power. And according to the apocryphal sort of description of why he chose orthodoxy rather than Latin, Roman Catholicism or Islam or Judaism, is to do with the fact that Islam forbid people to drink, and he said that that's completely out of the question. Drinking is the joy of the Rus. And in terms of the Jews, he thought they couldn't be that powerful if they'd been sort of chased out of their homeland, so he didn't want to emulate that. And he thought there was something very gloomy about the Latinate churches. And his envoys described how beautiful the service was in the church of San Sofia in Byzantium. And they said they didn't know if they were on heaven or on earth because it was such an extraordinary sight. So that's the story. So he adopted Christianity, and he forced his subjects to get baptized in the river Dnieper. And there was some quite strong opposition in various parts of the Slav territories. In Novgorod, there was a big uprising against it. But anyway, it became the country's religion, main religion, because obviously Russia is a multiconfessional state with Islam and Buddhism and Jews and a number of Catholics and Protestants. But it became the dominant religion. And I think one other point that I should pick up on is in the 16th century, to understand Putin's mindset, the abbot Filofeev Pskov, who in his Yelizarsky convent on the Estonian border, made this famous Third Rome Declaration, which I'm sure you've all know about, where he said to Grand Duke Vasily III that two Romes had fallen, the Rome in Italy, the Roman Empire, and the Second Rome, Byzantium, because the Ottoman Turks took over the city. And he said that Moscow has inherited the mantle of Christianity. It's the new beacon on the hill, and it's the third Rome, and a fourth Rome there shall not be. So this very much sort of feeds into the Ruski Mir narrative, that there's something sacred about Russia, that it has a messianic sort of mission to bring its whole view of the universe to the rest of the world and enlighten them. And you could argue that this was also adopted under communism, you know, when the Comintern went around trying to persuade people in the global south and other countries that this was the way forward. It was just a secular form of the same messianic vision about Russia has a special understanding and a way forward. So I think that Filofeev Pskov was quite an interesting and important character. And then you wanted me to talk about Nikon, didn't you? Because he was a century later, in the 17th century, and he was one of the few sort of people in the church that actually really stood up to secular power and tried to make Russia into some kind of theocracy. Because I think one common theme going through the whole book and what's happening now is that the church throughout history has done whatever it takes to sort of cement its relationship with whoever's in power, whether it's the Mongol overlords, whether it's the princes, whether it's the Politburo, whether it's Putin now, you know, to preserve its influence, enrich itself, be at the right hand of power. That's always been its motto. And Nikon was a little bit of a hiccup in that, because he sort of took advantage of the fact that Tsar Alexis was away fighting the Poles in Lithuania, on Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so he started getting too big for his boots, and he started telling people that the way they were worshipping and the books they were reading were all wrong. And he wanted to kind of take people's icons away and made a big bonfire with them. And there was a whole thing about well, some of the changes were quite minor, you know, whether you make the sign of the cross with 2 or 3 fingers, which direction you walk around the altar, how you write the name Jesus. But it really, really tore the country and the church apart. And to this day, there are the old believers that subscribe to the old way before Nikon came. And he did manage to make the church more Greek, if you like, going back to some Greek books that he felt there'd been a deviation away from what he felt was pravoslavny, means the right way to glorify God. I used to think Slav meant, you know, as in the Slav, the person, but it's Slava, glory. So it was really a big seismic change in Russia, but there haven't really been very many occasions when the church has really stood up to the state and tried to take power. There've been saints like Philip under Ivan the Terrible, who refused to bless the monarch because he said his murderous campaigns were so awful that he couldn't possibly sort of give him any kind of blessing or pray for him. and he was rewarded by being thrown into prison and then smothered with a pillow, having had his favorite nephew's head brought to him in a blanket. So he's a he's an example of a hierarch in the church who did stand up to authority and do what he thought was morally right. I think it's interesting that he's not really particularly popular in the church today. He's not made much of a fuss of Metropolitan Philip. After that, I think this schism really sort of weakened the authority of the church, and then it made it much easier when Peter the Great came along. He basically got rid of the patriarchate, replaced it with a holy synod, sort of made it a department of state, and robbed it of any sort of independence. And some of the things that he did were quite sinister, like he made it incumbent on priests during confession to inform the authorities if a parishioner told them something that could be detrimental to the state. So that's the beginning of the whole kind of Stukarch culture of kind of informing on your neighbors and things like that. I mean, I think also Peter was very pragmatic. He was excited by Western technology. He loved shipbuilding. He went to Britain and Holland, and he sort of found something a bit sort of creepy about all these priests in robes and that other people dressed like them. So he made his courtiers wear Western dress, and he made them shave off their beards. And if they didn't shave off their beards, he said he would tear them out by the roots. So he was very dogmatic about that. But he was also not really kind of bigoted about religion, because if it was good for business, he was all for it. So he invited Protestants to come and settle in his new city of St. Petersburg. He was open to Europe, window on Europe. So I think that while he was kind of orthodox, he wasn't that sort of driven by it, and he found a lot of superstitions about weeping icons rather laughable, and he was very keen on disproving them and showing that there were, if you turned an icon over, you saw little pinpricks in the eyes, and he said that the wax, when the church got hot, dripped through these little pinpricks, and that's why it looked like the icon was crying. And he had his cabinet of curiosities in which he kept pickled penises and all kinds of horrible things, and he put these icons there as well. So he was kind of delighted by the kind of weirdness of it. Plus he had these feasts in which he was very, very rude about certain figures in the church, of which I write about in my book. And Catherine was sort of, when she started, well, she was born in a Lutheran family. She wasn't Orthodox. She converted because that was the right thing to do. But at the beginning, she was interested in the Enlightenment, in education. She had this relationship, sort of correspondence with Voltaire. And she only really embraced orthodoxy out of pragmatism because she wanted to get rid of her husband, Peter III. She just absolutely loathed him, and the feeling was quite mutual. So he'd refused to wear the sash of St. Andrew, and he wanted some Lutheran one instead. And she kind of got on her horse and went to arrest him in the name of protecting orthodoxy. And then after that, in a more sinister way, she began to weaponize orthodoxy to build the empire. So, if Peter had opened up the Baltic and the north, she was determined to push south. So, her lover Potemkin seized Crimea and the Black Sea coast, which is now Ukraine. And she also had dreams of going all the way to Constantinople and becoming sort of this Greek sort of I don't know what the word is, sort of empress, and she saw herself as a sort of queen of all the Orthodox lands, and she wanted she wanted Russia to push into Turkey as well and seize that territory, but she didn't quite make it that far. That's in a very nutshell way a little bit of history, and I think that Putin is still influenced by all these characters because, on the day of the full-scale invasion, these oligarchs rushed to the Kremlin and said, what the hell's going on? And they were talking to Lavrov, the foreign minister, and he said, Putin's only got 3 real advisors, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. So I think he sees himself very much following on in that tradition, although some people think he's more like Nicholas I, who was keen on autocracy, nationhood, and orthodoxy as his tripartite slogan that went against the French fraternité, liberté, égalité. I said that the wrong way around, but you know what I mean.
And digging in a bit in the tradition that you already mentioned. Indeed, Orthodoxy in its history as well, in its Byzantine history, the core maybe feature of the Orthodox Church of even Byzantine Constantinopolitan Constantinopolitan Byzantine Church is its integration with the state, basically, and the clear hierarchy of power in between of the emperor, basically, and the patriarch, in which the subordinate relationships are very much set in stone, where the power is with the church basically is at service of the state in that sense. And that intricate relationship between the church and the state went through its own stages, of course, in Byzantium, entered as well the realm of the history of Russia. And maybe you can say more about the instances of your description of those exactly engagement between the state and the church in the context of Russian state now as well, and in some maybe anecdotal issues of the history that you find interesting in comparison again to what's happening now. You already said about Stukach culture, for example, which is very interesting as an anecdote in that sense, but that particular sort of element of integration of the church, even with secret services, even with engagement of church and the state in the Soviet history as well. That I think is also pretty fascinating facets of your book.
Yeah, well, I think that the current arrangement where the church is very much at the service of the state in overseas missions, was built by the Soviet-era KGB, and specifically, after, there was terrible persecution up to the Second World War, and there were very, very few bishops left when Stalin decided that he needed the church in order to kind of beat the Germans and push them out of the Soviet Union. So he reinstated the Patriarch, and he allowed seminaries to open again, he allowed church bells to be rung, he allowed all kinds of restoration of buildings that had been turned into meat storage plants, tractor repair workshops, and all manner of things. So it's not like there was a huge explosion of church building in Stalin's time, but the church was kind of got back some of its status, and it lost quite a lot under Khrushchev, because Khrushchev was very determined to kind of wipe out the influence of religion. He believed in a sort of scientific rationalism, and he's famous for talking about Yuri Gagarin going up into space, and that very famous colourful poster, Boga Niet, there is no God. But I think that there was a relationship. The KGB saw that the church could be very, very useful in spreading the right kind of messages abroad. So there was a kind of pact that the church has a certain amount of leeway inside the country, and it does the Kremlin's bidding abroad. And it goes to conferences and says that it's for peace, even though, Soviet Union was just invading at the beginning of Kirill's career, for example, Patriarch Kirill now. One of his first missions, where he was sent as an agent for the KGB, was to Australia for a meeting of the World Council of Churches. And you know, that was all about spreading peace. Even though, you know, there was the invasion of Afghanistan not very long after that. And that arrangement has still persisted to this day, but it's actually a lot stronger. And, you know, the two institutions that survived kind of intact throughout the 90s were the Soviet era, in a way, were the church and the security services. And the reason that the church was so important to the government and to the security services as a way of keeping tabs on people is that, you know, many other organizations and structures had been sort of liquidated in communist times, and also when the country was very poor and all kinds of funding dried up. But the church had a presence, you know, all the way from the Baltic to the Primoria, to Vladivostok, and down even into Kazakhstan and some parts of Central Asia. So it was a force that could be used it could be instrumentalized very profitably by the government to achieve the foreign policy aims, and also to keep a check on people at home, because, you know, basically the Communist Party spent quite a lot of its time in power trying to liquidate the church. And I think what happened really is that the church survived and sort of took over the role of the Communist Party. If you think now in Ukraine, you know, the military chaplains that are implanted with the Russian forces, they're very similar to the political commissars in Soviet times. And, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a call out saying we need more military chaplains, because there was a sort of tacit admission that there's a high degree of amorality among the Russian troops, committing all manner of atrocities and war crimes. But it was also to say, you know, not one step backwards, to thinking back to the whole Stalingrad thing, because one chaplain in the department of the church attached to the military was saying that 300, or maybe it was 700 conscripts that were sent to Kursk region to fight off the Ukrainian incursion had run away from their positions. But after they had a session with the chaplains, they decided that they would go back to the front line. So you see what I mean? It's this kind of thing. And I mean, we can talk a lot about the impact that the church is having on ordinary Russian families and people living in Russia now, but maybe we'll get onto that later.
And a bit continuing actually that line of integration of state and church, as well as adding the military context to that. You've already spoken about the, for example, Catherine the Great instrumentalization of spread of the orthodoxy onto the expansion of the Russian state as well. And one of the also trivias of Russia being baptized, basically, is the town in Crimea where the baptism of Vladimir himself happened.
Chersonis.
Yeah, Chersonis, and the recent also huge monument that was erected next to Kremlin of Vladimir, again exactly of the hero of that baptism of the Russian state. So that in specific historical as well sort of trivia and connection to the Putin's obsession with his role in history as well. So I wonder, how do you touch also those issues of the not only integration of the church and state, but actually weaponization of church in the context of the most, let's say, aggressive facets of the expansion of the state itself, including the Ukrainian war at the moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it was very clear when Putin wrote his essay, you know, in the summer before the full-scale invasion, that he's got no sort of concept of Ukraine as a sovereign country, that it's very annoying for both him and for Patriarch Kirill, the loss of Ukraine, because in their mind it's the baptismal font of Russian civilization that began in Kiev. And the idea that this country where Russia was born, if you like, doesn't want to have anything more to do with them is such a slap in the face and such a kind of negation of the whole Ruski Mir philosophy that it did become, in some ways, a casus belli. And for the Patriarch, losing Ukraine, 12,000 parishes under the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that are linked to the Moscow Patriarchate was a big loss of prestige and property and parishioners and everything. So, Putin said 3 days after the full-scale invasion that Ukraine is part of Russia's cultural and spiritual space. And, the idea that it might want to go and join the European Union or be allied with the rest of Europe sort of is unthinkable, unimaginable to his whole world view.
And then maybe if we go a little bit pivot a little bit from the political level to the sociological level, you also mentioned that one of the reasons that for writing the book was your interest in exactly the topic of domestic violence in Russia, and let's say the values that are being projected by the church to the society. So how do you touch those issues in the book as well, of how exactly the Russian morale forms and how it's dependent as well on how church behaves, or how exactly what values church communicates as well on the level of the society?
Well, the values the church communicates under Kirill seem to have very little to do with most people's understanding of Christianity. If you take, for example, Forgiveness Sunday, just at the beginning of the war, which is a time when people are supposed to, forgive trespasses against them committed by their neighbors and understand the wrongs that they may have done to other people. And it's a time of compassion, it's a time of understanding. But it was a time for Kirill to blame the West for sort of inciting the war by insisting on having gay pride parades. And that sort of seemed very strange, but it's all part of this rhetoric of the satanic West, which has just become more and more pronounced in Kirill's sermons as the war has gone on. And, some of it sounds quite jihadist, this idea that if you die killing Ukrainians on the battlefield, you will be washed of all your sins. And that almost seems to sort of legitimize war crimes in my mind. But I think that there is a connection between the violence against women and the violence that has been shown, this kind of rampant total contempt for human rights and human life that we've seen in this war. And, one priest who was saying that Orthodoxy has got quite a lot in common with the sort of Islamic Iranian version of, the way that women should be policed and told what to wear, and if they're not dressed correctly, they should be beaten. And I feel that, in a way, this kind of acclimatizing people or telling people that it doesn't matter if a man chops both his wife's hands off in the forest, like a very famous example, that there is no need for restraining orders, that basically a man has a right to punish his wife as he sees fit, just like in the time of Ivan the Terrible, in the Domostroy, a set of household rules drawn up in the 16th century. But you don't really think that those are rules that are applicable to 21st century Russia. But it seemed, in a way, that was the message that was being sent. And this kind of tolerance of violence has kind of been shown quite a lot on the battlefield and in these sorts of rapes that we've seen in Bucha and all kinds of other things that have happened in Izium, Kherson, numerous places in Ukraine. So I feel that, as in the Iranian state, where there's this kind of idea that that religion is a tool to control the population, it feels that that is the sort of orthodoxy that's being preached from the top now. I don't mean to say that that's the view of all of Russia's 40,000 priests. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of them are very, very much against the war. I know that some of them are, but it's difficult to speak out when, the penalties are so big, and a lot of them have big families and they have no transferable skills. It's not easy for them to find another job. If they get defrocked, they can end up sort of penniless, or worse, some of them have been imprisoned. Some of them have had to go abroad because they're actually afraid for their security. So putting your head above the parapet is very difficult in Russia now. A lot of clerics toe the line, whatever they may think privately. And I think that there are a few priests who really have totally embraced this ideology of the just holy war. If you take the example of Andrei Tkachov, who ironically is actually from Western Ukraine originally, and he has this rhetoric that is kind of totally off the wall. Like the other day he was saying that if people were killed in Russia by HIMARS missiles sent from Ukraine, it was because the abortion rate in Russia was too high. And another time he blamed the war on excessive masturbation. And it's kind of strange, but he's fantastically popular. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's a religious journalist in Moscow, and his church used to be run by a priest that everybody respected a lot, Uminsky, Alexey Uminsky, who is he's left the Patriarchate of Moscow and he's serving under the Patriarchate of Bartholomew, Constantinople in Paris. He basically was told that he should flee for his life because there were talks about how it wouldn't be safe for him to stay in Russia. But he was very much respected and loved because he worked with children's hospitals. All the intellectuals liked him. All the writers came to his church. It was in the center of Moscow. And he's been replaced not just by any old priest, but by this kind of insane warmongering character, Andrei Tkachov. And loads of people come there, and I'm thinking, like, why? It seems like it's a sort of sadomasochistic thing, that they want to be berated. They want to be told how terrible they are or something. I don't understand it. I think it's a little bit like the person who's now in Washington that was not necessarily talk about, but people are thinking, what crazy thing is he going to say next? And it's a bit the same with Tkachov, He makes all these outrageous statements and people sort of share them on their phones and say, you never guess what he just said, And so there's that going along. But I really don't think that he's very representative of most Russian Orthodox priests.
And another subject that came up in our conversation with you was repentance. Let's say in the usage of repentance as a sort of a political currency within the current political regime in Russia, and especially in the context of the war. For example, we had an event even here with a sociologist discussing that infamous naked party, after which there was a lot of repentance done by all the participants, including in the zones of so-called new territories of Russia, by the people who before that were avoiding participating directly or even indirectly in the context of the war. So maybe you could say something and maybe elaborate more on the subject of repentance, both now and historically as well, in the context of the church and its connection to the state.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked me about that, because the reason I called this book The Baton and the Cross was because I saw a poster in St. Petersburg of some police batons that were formed in the shape of a cross, and they were on a wall by a tram stop. Oh yeah, maybe you can show the picture of it. It's somewhere down there. And underneath it said pokaisa, repent. And I thought that this sort of summed up very well the way that the church is. It might be somewhere along there. That's one of these. That's the picture. Yeah, thank you. This idea of religion being used as a controlling mechanism. The police baton really summed it up. Some people saying, why did you call it the baton and the cross? They was thinking about a conductor's baton. And I'm saying, no, I'm talking about a police baton. When in Russia, dubinka is obvious what kind of baton I mean, but not so much maybe in English. So, but I think it's extraordinary, this naked party. I mean, the owner of the club where it took place, Multipolarity, yeah? He said that he was going to donate some kind of holy relics to a church. And I'm thinking, like, how come the owner of a Moscow club has got access to holy relics in the first place? It's a very kind of intriguing question. And then one singer who had 5 of her concerts cancelled after she took part in the Naked Party said she was going to build a church, in the Novaya Rossiya, so-called. It's really, I mean, this kind of craven display of sort of bowing down to the church is quite extraordinary, I would say. But, real Orthodox believers have been very skeptical of, born-again Soviet-era politicians who said they were dyed-in-the-wool atheists. And then they suddenly kind of turn up in church holding candles. So they called them candle holders, podsviechniki. And Anna Politkovskaya, the very famous journalist who was killed, made a lot of fun of these people and loved sort of talking about how they didn't know how to cross themselves. She said Medvedev kept sort of touching his groin and like doing it the wrong way around, and But I think that there's something. Like, on a more serious note, there's something so wrong about this fake sort of craven repentance when real repentance is so missing from Russia. I mean, there's not really been very much of a reckoning at government level of the crimes of the Stalin era. There's I was in Moscow, as were you, when the Solovetsky stone was put in front of the Lubyanka. Do you remember? It was snowing that day really heavily, and people were making all kinds of speeches about the persecution of people in the Gulag, and it's never going to happen again and stuff. And then we see the gradual rehabilitation of Stalin. The first time I saw him on a calendar in the Second World War Museum, not the one that's been built in the new Army Cathedral, but the old War Museum, I was really astonished, But now, I think the governor of Vologda has said that he wants a statue of Stalin built. There's a statue in Oryol to Ivan the Terrible, who's his kind of like predecessor, because Ivan the Terrible founded the first secret police in Russia with his oprichniki. And I think that it's very telling that a few months before the full-scale invasion, they liquidated Memorial, which was a fantastic organization documenting the crimes of the Stalin era and all the abuses of human rights, after that. So there doesn't feel like there's any really true repentance in the church at the moment. I mean, when I talk about the church, I'm talking about the hierarchy.
Maybe another interesting question, I think, is the interconfessional relations of the Russian Orthodox Church with other orthodoxies. I mean, obviously, the schism that happened in between of the Ukrainian church and Russian church as well, but also just in general positioning of the Russian church in the whole, let's say, Christian family of the churches. If you somehow touched that subject in the book.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk about it because I saw when I was there as a journalist in the early 90s how a lot of evangelicals were coming in from the US, and because people had very little, there was so much poverty then, there was very little health care, people were really desperate, and I went to a prayer meeting in the Luzhniki Stadium, giant football stadium in Moscow, and there were all these pastors from the US saying they were going to kind of get hundreds of thousands of souls for Jesus Christ. And people were kind of holding their arms up in the air and swaying to sort of rock music. And it felt a bit sort of strange. But, when I went around asking people why they'd come, they said, they needed some kind of hope because everything was so grim around them, and there was... their salaries had disappeared, they couldn't put food on the table, they didn't really see, what the point was of, they felt deprived of a motherland. And I think also it's important to say that the church in that time, in the early 90s, for many people it made them feel who they were, because there was a profound sense of a loss of identity. If we're not a superpower anymore, who are we? Oh, we're Orthodox Christians, and we are the Third Rome. We are, the ones who are sort of the true, deeper Christians who do everything properly and who sort of should set a path for the rest of the world to follow. But I think that it was a really difficult time, and people clung on to things like that. So I think after not very long, maybe in sort of 92, the British ambassador was approached by Alexey, the then Patriarch, who was complaining like mad about how all these foreign faiths were encroaching on his believers. And he felt that was very unfair, that they were using their money to print Bibles and basically take people away from the Orthodox Church just because they could, because they had the money, they were throwing their weight around. And I had some sympathy with that. I could understand, that, and you'd have conversations with people you met on night trains who'd come from Illinois or, I don't know, Oklahoma, who were coming to get all these souls for Jesus Christ. And, they had very little knowledge of Russia. They had no idea that, Christianity had been adopted in 988. They were sort of ignorant and also very disrespectful, I think, a lot of them. But, it has to be said that there were a lot of important social projects that Protestant groups did, Catholic groups in Russia, that were appreciated. And after a while, the sense that the Orthodox Church needed to preserve its kind of monopoly on people's religious beliefs became stronger and stronger. The FSB got involved in sort of getting rid of 5 Catholic bishops quite early on into Putin's time. And there were, the treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses is very extreme, but there are all sorts of persecutions going on. Jehovah's Witnesses are kind of seen as terrorists and have been, when they're just having a quiet prayer meeting at home, they've been arrested at gunpoint and flung on the floor and taken to prison. Even, I think, a woman in her 80s has been put behind bars. And I was trying to understand, why do Jehovah's Witnesses pose such a threat when there's not that many of them, and they're basically quite, they keep themselves to themselves, they worship mainly in the privacy of their homes, and I think it's partly because there's some sort of idea, because their logo had a Brooklyn Bridge on it, that this is the heart of the sort of evil Protestant empire, that there's a guy called Shipkov, Alexander Shipkov, who is very close to Patriarch Kirill and is obsessed with this idea of America as a great Protestant empire that is posing a huge threat to Russia. At the same time, the social conservatism of some evangelicals in the US is totally, they feel they make totally common cause with the more sort of ultra-conservative elements in the Russian Orthodox Church. So although they rant against this foreign influence, they actually have a lot of things they see in common. They don't like the idea of women's rights, abortion, right to choose. They're intensely homophobic, anti-migrant, many of those sort of white supremacist values. So in a way, it's quite strange that they spend a lot of time being so hostile. But I think the real schism in Ukraine is sort of where the most passion is, because it's a big loss of Kirill's canonical territory. And that's one reason why there's such a battle going on now for the soul of Ukrainian Orthodoxy.
I mean, I have countless more questions, including, for example, the amplification of homophobia in Russia and its interrelation with the church, and maybe the law of the church, whether you covered that point of the 1917 revolution and the existential, let's say, threat to the orthodoxy, and how exactly existential it was, whether you covered that subject as well in the book, and your thoughts on the subject. But I would rather open the floor, and maybe some of you will just, double down on those questions. Yeah, let's maybe hear some questions from you.
Thank you for an interesting talk, very interesting talk. I got a feeling as you were talking about some of the typical people who supported the church, that their sense of xenophobia and various other feelings about the world seemed remarkably similar to the typical Trump supporter in the US. And I just wondered if you thought there was some kind of convergence there, which may explain why Trump and Putin seem to be able possibly to get on with each other. That sense of empire, for example, seems remarkably shared between Putin and the US. I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah, well, actually, this is something that I'm looking into right now, because they call them the Ortho Bros, and they are quite an extraordinary group, and they're spread across America, but there's quite a lot of them in the South, which is traditionally more conservative and more Bible bashing, more church-going, if you like, than other parts of the US. And I think that it's been driven quite a lot by disillusion with Catholicism and evangelical churches, because they think they've gone too woke. You know, they've got tolerating the idea of women bishops or women priests. They don't like the idea that abortion should be something that a woman decides about. Definitely very homophobic, and definitely very concerned about Christian culture being overtaken by Islam. That's a very big theme. So I think they have a lot in common. That there is a very interesting book that's been written by an American anthropologist who went and spent a few months in a monastery. It's the largest Russian Orthodox monastery in the world that's English-speaking. And all the monks are actually American citizens, but they talk as if they are total Putin acolytes. And one of them even told her that he wanted Putin to come and invade America, because he felt that America has lost the way, that true Christianity is practiced only in Russia, and that if they don't sort of embrace this sort of more masculine, sort of tougher brand of Christianity, the whole country's going to go to hell in a handbasket. And they like it appeals to certain kind of people that don't like chatty church services that are over sort of too quickly. They like the idea of something that is that hasn't changed for centuries. They like the idea of services that are 3 hours long, where there's more of a sort of mystical aura. I think people are thirsting for that in these communities quite a lot. So I don't know, I'll probably know more about it in a few months' time, but I'm definitely going to look into it.
Thank you, it's a fascinating topic. What I wanted to comment and ask your opinion on something which I can also reflect from my experience in a 2,000 people Russian village in Vologda Oblast. And according to ChatGPT, it's only about 5 to 7% are true believers of the Russian population, and perhaps 10 to 15% are kind of go to church Christmas and Easter. And I can say this is the case. I mean, when we started our project in this village 15 years ago, about 40 people were going to the church in the next village. We restored the church in the village, and there was a new priest, and the number of people didn't increase. So from that, I would take that my opinion would be that the influence of church is a bit overrated in Russia, and the majority of population are not influenced and still have this inheritance of the Soviet Boga нет topic. And
that mindset, yeah. I mean, there's some quite interesting research on what does it mean to be Orthodox? I mean, 70% of Russians say they're Orthodox, but that's more of an identity question. And in terms of church going, Ministry of Interior figures show that people, like less than 5% attended Christmas and Easter services, I think, in 2022, to my recollection. So I think that you have the old grannies, the babushki, who kind of go and buy candles and tell everyone what to do and tell you off that you're not wearing the right clothes like they always do. But a lot of churches in the provinces really, really struggle. And they, at the same time, are supposed to donate money to the diocese. And sometimes I just don't really understand how this can work, because, there's a priest who is really just struggling to heat the church so that people will be able to come and not freeze to death during the long liturgy. And he's supposed to give money to his bishop, and then the bishop in turn is supposed to give money to the patriarchate. And the whole way that money goes in the church is upwards to a certain person at the pinnacle. So there was a very good article in the Russian magazine Taki Dela about one remote church where the priest decided that he really wanted to try to rebuild the church, but he was doing it pretty much on his own. And to make ends meet and to have a bit of money left over to buy building materials for the church, he also acted as the village's taxi driver. He had a van. And when the motor broke down, the engine, he did an appeal on Facebook saying, could somebody sort of help donate some money so I can take the van to the garage and get it fixed? Because, otherwise I can't earn any money for the church and stuff. And a lot of people were very angry because they felt that it was like the church's dirty washing had been aired in public, and that you weren't supposed to say these kinds of things. You weren't supposed to look like you're desperate for money. But, I thought that he was a very pragmatic guy who was trying to do his best by his flock. So, you know, I think that the whole Christianity, in a way that many Orthodox people, genuinely Orthodox believers, would see it, is that it's not really what Kirill and his senior bishops are interested in. And, you know, one Ukrainian bishop said to me that the Russian Orthodox Church is no different from any other branch of state, or Gazprom or Rosneft. You know, it's sort of politicians in cassocks or security service people in cassocks. They're not going to tell you the mysteries of life or worry about your salvation. They've got more earthly concerns on their agenda.
There was a question somewhere. Oh.
Sorry, this is not the question I was originally going to ask, so I pieced it together a little bit from a side reference you made about babushkas. I was thinking, well, these are people who were born in the Stalin period. So these people who has been a great geriatric conversion to Orthodoxy, or are these people who are actually, I'm thinking about the generation who kept Christianity alive and Orthodoxy alive through the Soviet period. So that's not very ill-formed, but it's...
No, those are people that I have kind of immense respect for. And there's so many interesting Soviet propaganda posters demonizing the babushki, saying that, you know, that they are holding people back. There's quite a famous one of a little boy who's looking longingly out the window. He wants to go and join his friends who are wearing little red pioneer neck scarves, and they're playing in the sunshine. And the evil old granny is dragging him into the corner to worship the icon. But, you know, then when, in 1990, you know, when I came to Moscow to work for the BBC, all kinds of people started saying, oh yes, well, I was secretly baptized by my grandmother. And, you know, that's what Putin says as well, you know, or you know, with the help of a neighbor. Lots of these older women did keep the faith alive. And they, especially in the countryside, there was a very strong sense of... one of the things about Orthodoxy that's quite beguiling is the way that it marks the seasons with different feasts and different celebrations. And, you know, the whole rhythm of the year is reflected in these different things. And so even in Soviet times, they were still baking the kulich at Easter and sort of painting eggs and doing all kinds of other things. But you know, sometimes it was slightly disguised as a sort of folk ritual rather than something religious. But I think that given how hard it was to get your hands on a Bible for most of the Soviet era, you know, these very devout women, you know, basically did what they could to educate people about, and so sometimes the message gets a bit distorted, but I think that when I see old women in church standing for 3 hours in a service, you can't help but be moved by it. Because, you know, after about an hour, I'm sort of going from foot to foot and sort of like thinking, oh, my back's hurting. And they're just immovable, like rocks. And I think, like, how? How are they like that? So... it's not something that can be easily dismissed, is what I want to say.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Having read the book, and I may get this wrong, but it's an interesting question for the moment. Obviously there's a division of the Orthodox churches in Ukraine between those who support Russia and those who don't. But at the moment, there's still... I was quite surprised by how few of those who supported Russia switched after the invasion. there seem to be very few. And so I'm just wondering now whether, in the light of where we are now, that's an incredibly difficult map of where the Russian Orthodox still seems to have claims on Ukraine, because actually those who could have switched at that point didn't. And so it's a mixed bag. So I just wanted to have your sort of sense, whether that was correct. I might not have read that correctly, but it's just, it seemed like a very complex situation given where we are now.
Well, it is a very complex and nuanced situation. Basically, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine was under Moscow for 300 years. And then under the previous president, Poroshenko, the Patriarch of Constantinople gave the Orthodox Church, gave a tomos, which is a kind of ability to have an autocephalous, like self-governing church. So that was something which absolutely enraged Kirill and Putin. And this church is called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, as opposed to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So it is very confusing. And when I went there in September, sort of 6 months into the full-scale invasion, quite a few parishes and priests were moving over from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, because in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kirill was still being commemorated in the liturgy as the head of the mother church. And a lot of people found that very difficult to stomach when the Russian army was bombarding them night after night with artillery and rockets. And so then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church said in June of 22 that it was independent, but that is only on a rhetorical level. And the Patriarch of Moscow has just kind of come out with their 2025 calendar, in which they have like more than 40 priests who are from Ukraine, which they say are still under their jurisdiction. So even if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church wants to tell people that they've got nothing more to do with Moscow, that's not legally the situation. But a lot of believers feel that they are on very difficult ground with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, because they've been told by Kirill that it's not a canonical church. So they think that they won't get to heaven, basically, just very bluntly, that they won't find salvation in an uncanonical church. And that was even the case with a woman that I met on the bus going to a pilgrimage, who had been cowering in her basement in Bucha for 3 weeks when the Russian troops arrived. She was on the bus with her daughter. And I said, well, why are you still with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that's linked to Moscow? And she said, I don't want to lose eternal grace, basically. But there are other reasons why people want to stay in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because it's the church that they know, it's the church where the liturgy's in Church Slavonic instead of Ukrainian, it's what they're used to, they like their priests, they've got friends in the congregation. And I think that it's definitely true that there have been some priests, quite a number of them, who the security services of Ukraine have found have been passing on information about Ukrainian army movements to the enemy, or have been sort of acting in a treasonable way otherwise. But that's not the case with all of the Ukrainian Orthodox priests. I mean, some of them are staunch Ukrainian patriots. So it's very painful, basically. This is a very painful schism in the church, and it's not sort of easy to solve, but it's very easy to distort. So there's a very powerful lobby that's going to Capitol Hill in Washington and telling people that Zelensky's government is murdering priests, and that Christians are being persecuted in Ukraine by this terrible Zelensky government, which is kind of very dangerous in terms of the support that a lot of Ukrainians hope to get from America, although, today that support seems very much in the balance. But I feel like there's a big danger in simplifying with these messages. And I think that, it's a difficult balancing act for the Ukrainian government, because obviously there is a Trojan horse element about some people in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who have been spreading sort of pro-Kremlin narratives, but at the same time they want to be seen to be observing proper procedures and not trampling on people's spiritual freedom and telling them which church they should belong to or not. So yeah, it's tricky.
A question from our online audience. How have the old believers fared during the war? Have they kept quiet?
Well, there are different pockets of old believers. Some of them have been towing the Kremlin line. Some of them are quite sort of disconnected from politics altogether and live in quite remote communities. I felt that maybe they could be an alternative moral source of strength when it seemed that the Moscow Patriarchate was so enthralled to this warmongering narrative and this Ruski Mir propaganda. But sadly, I don't really feel that that is the case. I may be wrong, and I'd be very glad to be put right on that matter, but so far I haven't seen much sign of a sort of opposition to the official narrative that Kirill has been putting out.
Any more questions in the audience? Then I'll shoot another one from the online audience. Does the Orthodox Church have any programs in the social sphere? It's a pretty wide question, but I guess what the person means is there a very significant presence of the church in the social sphere that is noticeable, and it's in somehow competing with the state in the specific in the resolution of specific social issues or problems? And is there a tension on that ground?
I don't really feel it's competing with the state, but I was very interested, for example, in the degree to which the church has been complicit or not in the abduction of thousands of children from Ukraine, because quite a few of them have been resettled in observant families, and they've been taken to meet the Patriarch, they've been lectured about, they've been told that they have to free their minds from the sort of fascist Ukrainian Nazi mindset that's been imposed on them. And the church seems to have been very active in this. I do write about that in my book. I think that in the social sphere, one of the things that struck home with Pussy Riot when they made their infamous punk prayer in the cathedral and begged the Mother of God to drive Putin away, was they talked quite a lot about the church's obsession with wealth. And it seems quite obvious to people that people high up in the church have quite a luxurious lifestyle, while many priests, like the one that the lady in the audience was telling us about in Vologda, you know, are really on the brink of poverty. And I think that this is something people can't fail to notice. And I've been told by some believers that the Russian Orthodox Church isn't so much interested in doing good on earth and sort of running soup kitchens because they've got their mind on higher things. But I think that a lot of people don't think that washes, and it means that respect for the church has kind of plummeted, because there's a lot of kind of memes that you see online about, you know, Kirill sort of with his $30,000 Breguet Swiss watches and gold everywhere. Sorry? Disappearing watches, yes. Because, yeah, they took it off his wrist, but they forgot to erase the reflection on the table. Some people think that was a mistake. I think it was actually done deliberately to bring him to heel, because he he was speaking out when Putin wanted to become president for the third time, and there were lots of huge demonstrations in Moscow and other cities talking about ballot fraud, and now Alexey Navalny came to the fore talking about the party of crooks and thieves, United Russia. Kirill started making some sorts of slightly off-key remarks as far as Putin was concerned. He said that maybe the protests were a legitimate reaction to this kind of ballot fraud. And he was kind of swiftly sat on, in my opinion, because a whole load of stories came out in the press about his Swiss watch, about the way that he treated his neighbor who was suffering from cancer, didn't make him look very Christian. So those kinds of things.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you actually about Navalny, and obviously he had a religious funeral. I think the priest got demoted afterwards or something. But I just wondered if maybe it's clutching at straws. Was there any sense in which, because he was obviously kind of referencing religion, he wasn't a completely a-religious kind of movement, do you think does that germinated at all? Is there any reason for hope in that? Was there any kind of sense of a movement there, of a kind of religious, maybe slightly anti-formal church, progressive kind of movement that may be enduring or simmering under the surface?
Well, I think it might be exaggerating things to call it a movement. I mean, there are some priests, one of them was the dean of the cathedral in Madrid, the Reverend Andrei Gordochkin, who has founded a group called Mir Всем, Peace to All, which tries to unite people that are opposed to the war and help priests who've been defrocked and deprived of their income, who are in kind of dire financial circumstances. So it's a kind of solidarity group. But I think with Alexey Navalny was, quoting the Bible in court. And I think that people, even the most cynical Russians, were totally appalled when the authorities refused to hand over his body for 9 days. And there were quite a few people that went online or did kind of little videos about that, saying, that this was for a Christian leader to be sort of not speaking out at this point and just remaining silent was totally unacceptable. So, I think it was one of those moments, a kind of watershed moment when people could see sort of what kind of a church this is that doesn't give the body of a man who's been murdered in prison back to his mother. And as for the priest who kind of, on the 40th day after his burial, went and sang at his grave and then was banned from service, it speaks volumes to me.
Maybe one more question from my Pandora jar on the subject, actually, that sometimes it's forgotten again, that Russia is multi-confessional state, and also even the war effort is itself against Ukraine is led as well by the Caucasian republics, which are Muslim, and as well as, for example, the soldiers from Buryatia who are Buddhists, again by the confession. So I wonder if you approach that subject of also domination somewhat of this titular status of the Orthodox Church in relation to the state, and that's sort of a weird but delicate balance that is being preserved in the interconfessional dialogue within the Russia itself.
Yeah, well, I think the case of the Caucasus, especially the Chechen brigades under Ramzan Kadyrov, is a separate issue. And basically, he has made a sort of pact with Putin that he's got carte blanche to do what he likes inside Chechnya, murder his enemies or whatever, and allow old men to marry young girls, whether they want to get married or not, for example. All kinds of human rights abuses, not to speak of what's happened to gay men there who've been brutally murdered and tortured. And all of that kind of goes on and is fine as long as he's slavishly loyal to Putin, which he has been in this war in Ukraine with some of the Kadyrovsi, the brigades that go and fight. In Buryatia, I think it's a different situation. I mean, the Buddhist leader was also sort of backing up the war narrative and saying that he hoped that his soldiers would prove themselves worthy heirs of Genghis Khan and things like that. But I think that a lot of people have signed up in those parts of the Russian Federation, Buryatia, Chukhotka, because there is no work, and the bonuses and the salaries that they're offering to soldiers are very appealing. You know, that most of the deaths, when there's a very good project between Medusa and the BBC, some former colleagues of mine are doing, where they're going around and like mapping out all the gravestones, trying to kind of work out exactly how many Russian troops have been killed in this war, you know, because there are estimates from the CIA and there are estimates from the Ukrainian government, and then there are underestimates on the Russian side. And, you know, there are a lot of people that are missing in action that you don't know what's happened to them. But I think this is a really valuable project. And I think that it's really important to sort of remember that a lot of these people that have given their lives in a war that should never have started, unprovoked war of aggression, you know, are just desperate young men who are sort of trying to make their way in life. And, you know, a lot of them, their life expectancy once they reach the front line is just like less than a week. And it's a colossal loss of human life, which nobody in the higher echelons of Russian government, least of all Putin, seemed to care about at all.
Any more questions from the audience? Well, in that case, you also have a chance to ask the questions in a more informal fashion because the bar is open. I invited to join me in a round of applause to Lucy. Thank you so much. Lucy's book is available for purchase in the bookshop, and it's a perfect opportunity because you have an author who can sign something on the book personally for you. So please stay on, mingle, chat, and yeah, thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you very soon here.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming out on such a cold night.